GSSI Social Science. My name is Alberto Mazzucchi. I'm an associate prof here of Applied Economics, and today I'm chairing the seminar, which is given by Marianna Marino. And Marianna is an associate professor at Schema in Lille. Schema is a business school, a multi-campus business school in France, but also in the world. So it's a global higher education provider and research center. Marianna has been active on a number of research fields which are quite connected to what we do at the GSSI. Just to mention some, there is innovation and entrepreneurship, the evaluation of R&D subsidies and innovation policies, and also, as you can see in this particular paper, but also in other ones, she has worked at the intersection between sustainability and innovation as well. The paper is an interesting one, and I think it's going to spark a lot of interesting questions and insights. So the paper is about total and environmental R&D investment. It's about whether these are cyclical, anti-cyclical, pro-cyclical, and there's also a tiny bit of policy evaluation, which I like, because as Marianna, I started my career working on the additionality of R&D subsidies, so it's a very nice opportunity to go back a little bit in time and refresh some young memories. The rules of the game are as usual. So we've got 1 hour of presentation. I'm going to give you the last 5 minutes. Marianna has agreed, and then we have an hour with questions from the audience. The seminar is broadcasted on YouTube as well. So there is a colleague who is going to collect the questions from the possible viewers that are connected on YouTube. The last thing that I am going to mention is that the seminar is recorded. So by staying here on the Zoom, you agree of being recorded. Essentially, if you object with that, but you can, and you still want to follow the seminar, you can follow the seminar on YouTube. So by staying here, we assume that you want to be recorded and you're fine with that. So Marianna, the floor is yours. Thanks for having accepted our invitation. And yeah, whenever you want, you can start.
Thank you, Alberto, for this nice introduction, and thank you for this invitation. It is really a pleasure for me to present my work in this seminar. And I would like to start by saying something about the topic that I'm going to discuss today, because as you mentioned, when you invited me for the seminar, I had the big ambition of presenting the preliminary findings of 2 contributions of 2 papers that I'm working on in this period, which relate to the relationship between business cycle and total and environmental investments in research and development. However, while preparing the presentation, I realized that I have so many tables and results that I realized it was really too ambitious to present these 2 contributions just in 1 hour. So I decided to focus on one topic, but I'm very happy to share with you after the seminar or in another moment the preliminary findings that we have on the environmental part of the research. And today, instead, I'm going to present this paper that you see displayed in this slide, which specifically deals with R&D investments and the effectiveness of R&D policy tools over the business cycle. This is a joint work with Jarle Moen, who works at the Norwegian School of Economics, and Pierpaolo Parrotta, who works at IESEG School of Business in France. The outline of the presentation is a standard one. I will provide you the motivation of this paper. Then I will describe the data that we use, the estimation strategy, and focus quite a lot on the results before concluding. So the motivation is rooted into an empirical evidence that you can easily see in this figure. In this figure, we have several countries for which I have plotted the GDP growth and the share of business research and development financed by the government over time. And we can see that in almost any national setting, the business financed by the government follows a divergent pattern compared with GDP growth. And in particular, when there is a decrease in the GDP growth, we see instead a corresponding increase of the business financed by the government. So it seems that across different national settings, policymakers increase the public funding to support private research in recessionary periods. So when companies, at least in principle, should face some constraints in doing their R&D activity. And this is true, for example, if we look at what happened in the last big financial crisis, around 2008 to 2009. In that period, across OECD countries, there was an increase of around 3% of the public expenditure devoted to research and development. Nowadays, we are facing another deep economic crisis, and several countries have already declared that in the next future, they plan to increase quite substantially the public resources to support private R&D. Just to give you an example, in France, the French government has recently announced that in the next 10 years, they will be increasing the public budget to R&D by around 30%. And similar declarations have been done by authorities in Japan and in other advanced economies, at least. So this idea of policymakers of using public finances to support R&D in downturns seems to be linked with the evidence that we find in several empirical papers showing that there is indeed what technically is called R&D pro-cyclicality. And our, let's say, aim in this paper is to contribute to this debate, to dig deeper into this relationship between policy tools, innovation policy, R&D pro-cyclicality, and effectiveness of these policy tools, especially in periods of downturns. Is there any difference, for example, between a big recession and a normal negative trend of the business cycle? We have a time span in our data, as you can see, that allows us to do these considerations. If we look at the economic theory and evidence, it seems that there is, let's say, a divergence between what the theory predicts and what the empirical findings show us. Because theoretically, investments in research and development should be counter-cyclical. And the reason is very straightforward. It is more convenient for firms to invest in any productivity enhancing activity, including R&D, when the opportunity cost is lower, so in recessionary periods. However, as I mentioned before, empirical research shows that in reality, the opposite happens. So this is already a bit surprising, and economists from different perspectives have tried to find motivations and justifications of these empirical findings. And the most cited one among the others is the role played by demand factors. Basically, according to this view, companies are seen as profit maximizers, and therefore they try to concentrate their R&D efforts in periods of economic recovery, in periods of boom, because of the higher demand that they face in those periods compared with recessions. There are, of course, also arguments related to the fact that in reality, companies face financial constraints. According to Aguillon and co-authors, if companies had unlimited financial resources, they would invest counter-cyclically in research and development. However, reality is different. The most of companies face financial constraints. These financial constraints increase the likelihood of having credit constraints, and therefore firms in these conditions prefer to postpone risky R&D projects in periods in which they will have more availability of financial resources in order to avoid the risk of even failure of those risky projects because they don't have enough money basically to finance the projects. There are also arguments related to market competition, which this argument is very much related to the previous one because the argument goes as follows. When market competition is high, companies have low price cost margins, which is an element that determine lower financial resources availability for those firms, and this could lead to budgetary cuts in the case of R&D investments, especially when there are crisis periods. Another argument is the threat of imitation. Barr-Levy 2007 has argued that innovators are very well aware about the existence of knowledge spillovers associated with their R&D investments, meaning that they know that they cannot fully appropriate the knowledge that they produce, basically. They know that rivals will absorb these knowledge spillovers, and that they will come up with imitations of the original innovating products or services. However, this scholar argues that imitation comes with a time lag. It's not simultaneous to the investment in research and development. So given this and the awareness of all these, innovators time strategically their investment in research and development and tend to concentrate them when there is high demand, because if they invested in periods of recessions, rivals would have enough time to absorb knowledge spillovers to come up with imitating products which will be launched into the market later on during the recovery phase. So in order to not create, let's say, this advantage for imitators and rivals due to knowledge spillovers, there is this strategic timing of investments in research and development. It has also been shown that imitation is more likely to happen in market settings and in industries with weaker intellectual property right protection. And this, there is evidence that in those industries, R&D investments are indeed more pro-cyclical. However, there are also some arguments, at least in theory, which, let's say, go a bit against the hypothesis of R&D cyclicality. For example, the role of cooperation, and in particular, the role of cooperation with rivals. It has been argued that cooperation with rivals can reduce the sunk costs and fixed costs associated with R&D investments. This could create less, let's say, sensitivity of companies engaged in this kind of cooperation to fluctuations of the business cycle, and therefore, in this case, R&D investments should not display a pro-cyclical pattern. Labor economists, so if we borrow from labor economics literature, have instead identified this phenomenon called labor hoarding. And according to this perspective, firms hoard high-skilled workers in periods of recessions in order to have their expertise and knowledge and their talent, I would say, available when there will be the recovery phase. And since skilled labor is the major input in the R&D investment, in the R&D process of firms, this would justify the fact that R&D expenditure, private R&D expenditure, would not follow a pro-cyclical pattern. Economists in the field of economics of innovation have instead underlined quite frequently the role of persistence of innovation. Persistence of innovation relates to the idea that innovation is a path-dependent activity. It's a learning process which is embedded into the routines of the firm, into the organizational structure, in the way activities are organized, and it's a process that leads to what is called the creative accumulation that should make companies that I define high innovators for the sake of simplicity, less sensitive to the business cycle and probably more likely to invest in recessionary periods and not to display anyway a pro-cyclicality of R&D investment. And related to this argument, Archibugi and co-authors have predicted, at least from a theoretical point of view, that those firms implementing ambidextrous innovation strategies, so combining exploitation and exploration strategies, should increase more likely their research and development investments during crisis and not during upturns. So this is basically a quick summary of the theory related to the relationship between R&D investments over the business cycle. This literature in our paper is combined with the literature of the effectiveness of policy tools over the business cycle. This subfield of the literature in economics of innovation is quite scant. There are a lot of papers, and I also, with my co-authors, contributed to that field, assessing in general the effectiveness of public policy, public R&D policy, innovation policy. But just a few papers that have looked at what happened to this effectiveness when it comes to economic crisis. In particular, we found these two papers that have done that. The first one, a paper on Germany, the case of Germany, with data between 2006 and 2010. And in this analysis, the author find a crowding out effect of R&D subsidies in 2009, so in the year of the deep financial crisis. They do find a slight additionality effect after 2009, so in the recovery phase, basically, but this additionality effect, they claim, is, and they show in the data, is lower than the additionality effect of the pre-crisis period. Instead, a second paper that we found collects data for several countries, 5 countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and UK, over the period 2007 and 2009, so a more restricted sample, and they find no evidence of additionality effect. We want to contribute with this paper to this literature, first of all, by not simply looking at the R&D subsidy, but looking at the composition of R&D public support, because we have data on subsidies and tax credit, which are the two major policy tools used by policymakers when it comes to finance and support private R&D. We want to evaluate the effectiveness of these policy tools over time, not only in a restricted time window. So in order to really basically combine the literature on R&D cyclicality or counter-cyclicality and the literature on the funding. We would like to use, what we do is to use the theory on R&D cyclicality to test hypotheses and potential mechanisms that could help us to rationalize our heterogeneous findings, because we do find heterogeneity in the response to this public financing to research and development, depending on the profile of the firm, depending on certain characteristics that I'm going to show you in a minute. What is the novelty? So what is our contribution? There are no previous studies that have combined these two literatures, first of all. And second, there is the relevance of better understanding, targeting, and modulation of public R&D policy tools, hopefully to give some insights to policymakers to how to combine these tools and how to select companies in order to speed up economic recovery during periods of economic crisis. The data. The data that we use are data from Norway. We combine 3 different data sources. We have the R&D and the Inno survey. The Inno survey is basically the CIS survey in Norway, which has the main variables that are used, that are present in the CIS survey in other countries, plus some specific questions, basically, that are specific to the Norwegian case. And then we have the Norwegian register of company accounts, where we were able to collect financial variables at firm level. This is a descriptive evidence of some of the main variables that we use. In the figure at the top, we have the private R&D and the public support to R&D, which is the sum of R&D subsidy and R&D tax credit. And as you can see, the public support is a small percentage of the total private research and development. In the figure at the bottom, instead, we have the direct funding and the R&D tax credit. And what we can notice is that the direct funding increased slightly over time until 2014, at least. However, if we compare the 2 policy tools, it seems that Norwegian authorities rely more on the R&D tax credit than on the R&D, the direct funding, basically. We start our sample in 2002 because this is the first year in the data in which we have the 2 policy tools that are both available. In this table, instead, we have the list of variables, basically, that we use. We have as outcome variables the natural logarithm of private research and development. And as I'll show you in a robustness check, we also take this outcome variable in first differences. Then we have the so-called treatments. So the log of R&D direct funding and R&D tax credit. And in the first differences model, we take the same variables in first differences as well. Then we have lagged firm controls, the logarithm of sales over employee, equity ratio, debt over sales ratio, the basically a measure of intensity of R&D over employees, R&D loans, which are private loans, I mean, not provided by the state, basically. Then we have the log of the average firm wage. And in the model in first differences, we take all these variables, these controls in first differences. Then we have standard controls regarding the size, defined according to these 4 categories that you see at the bottom of the table. So size 1, employees, less than 20 employees, size 2, employees between 20 and 50, size 3, employees between 50 and 100, and the largest firm having employees more than 100 employees. And then we have the industries. The industries are displayed in this table which I inserted in the presentation just to show you that we have basically both manufacturing and non-manufacturing industries. Of course, there are some industries that are more populated than others, as one would expect. This table instead indicates the timeline that we have. So from 2002 to 2014, the GDP growth variable, which helps us to calculate an indicator that we called upturns or downturns according to the value associated with this indicator. Basically, we have given to the indicator value 0 when there is a negative change from one year to the other of the GDP growth. Like, for example, it happens between 2001 and 2003. We have a decrease, so we identify that year as a downturn. When there is an increase in the GDP growth, we give to this indicator value 1. There is also the last column of the table, which indicates the sample proportion. And I just would like you to notice that the sample proportion increases over time. So we have a higher number of observations in the last years of the data, and this simply reflects the participation of companies to the R&D survey. Probably it's data-driven, this sample proportion across years. The estimation strategy. We use, to start with, a panel fixed effect estimation approach. We have two main variables. The first one to assess the R&D cyclicality, where we take the natural logarithm of private research and development as an outcome variable. And the main regressor in this case is, of course, the GDP growth. We have standard region, industry, and size controls, plus the firm level controls that I mentioned to you before with a time lag. And we also take the value of private research and development investment with 1 year lag to further control for this, let's say, the previous investment in research and development. Then we have a second regression in which that we use to assess the additionality over the business cycle, so in upturns and downturns. In this case, the outcome variable is the same, and we have the treatment variables, so the two policy tools that I mentioned, the direct R&D funding and the R&D tax credit. The controls are basically the same as the previous regression. So let's go to the most important part, the results. In this first table, you can see that we run several regressions. The fully specified models are displayed in column 3 and column 6. We have two outcome variables. Just as a test, we used also the logarithm of sales to compare this outcome variable with our main outcome variable, the private R&D expenditure. And we see that, as expected, sales are pro-cyclical because we have a positive and significant coefficient. But we also find a positive and significant coefficient for the private R&D investment. So we find a result which is basically in line with previous papers, previous studies that have also found this kind of evidence, this kind of R&D patterns when it comes to look at the trend of the business cycle. When instead we look at the policy tools, we do find positive and significant coefficients for both policy tools, meaning that there is evidence of an additionality effect. At least on the full sample, we find additionality effect. And what is interesting is that when we split our sample in upturns and downturns, we still find additionality, but it seems if we look at the magnitude of coefficients for both policy tools, it seems that in downturns, we have a stronger additionality effect. These are the results on the full sample. What I'm going to show you from this slide on are a battery of tests that we have done by splitting the full sample into subsamples. The criteria that we have used are the standard criteria that we use in applied economics. For example, in this particular slide, we distinguish between small and large firms. In the following slides, you will see splits that are in line with the theoretical predictions that I have quickly discussed in the previous slides. So concerning the size of the company, of course, it's for the sake of simplicity that we have defined large firms as those ones having more than 50 employees, simply to make a distinction between small firms, those with less than 50, and basically the complementary group. This is the logic that we have used in the paper so far. When we look at the coefficient associated with the GDP growth, that for the sake of simplicity, I will call the cyclicality coefficient, we still find a positive and significant effect. So for both subsamples, there is R&D cyclicality. However, when we look at the policy tools, it seems that small firms do not display the same results as large firms or larger firms. Because, for example, the direct funding is not significant. The coefficient associated with the direct funding is not significant in upturns. It turns significant in downturns, but if we compare this particular coefficient with the coefficient of the same variable for the complementary group, we find that the magnitude is much smaller. The tax credit seems to behave in a similar way. And another thing that I have noticed is also that when it comes to large companies, there is no big difference between additionality in upturns and additionality in downturns. A second split that we have done is the distinction between manufacturing and non-manufacturing firms. It seems that there is cyclicality of R&D investment. This cyclicality is stronger for non-manufacturing firms, industries, and instead, regarding the policy tools, in this case, we don't find big differences between the two subsamples, both for the direct funding and for the R&D tax credit. So it seems that in this case, the main results are basically confirmed. Then we have looked at this dimension. We have not found papers that have done this before. Basically, we have taken this variable, we have computed this variable that we called public support, which is, simply speaking, the ratio between the sum of the R&D tax credit and the R&D subsidy over the total R&D investment. And we have defined those firms that belong to the fourth quartile as highly supported firms, to make a distinction with less supported firms that belong to either the first, the second, or the third quartile. It is interesting to notice that highly supported firms do not display a significant coefficient for the GDP growth variable. So in this case, it seems that those companies that receive an high amount of high support from the policymakers, it doesn't matter in which phase of the business cycle they are. Basically, they are not sensitive to this element. And even when we look at the policy tools although we still find additionality because of the significance and the sign of coefficients in both subsamples, if we compare the magnitude of these coefficients, it seems that the additionality effect is lower for highly supported firms. Another important check that we have done is the distinction between firms with high financial constraints and firms with less financial constraints. The financial constraints have been calculated by using this ratio, cash over equity. We have taken, in this case, the first quartile, companies belonging to the first quartile. And although in both subsamples, we find a cyclicality coefficient that is positive and significant, we can see that the cyclicality is stronger for high liquidity constrained firms, which is, in our opinion, a finding which goes in line with the predictions of the literature, in particular with what Aguillon and co-authors said. And it seems that for these companies, especially in downturns, generating additional investments, private investments in research and development, given that they received public support for that activity, it's a bit more difficult, basically. There is additionality, also in this case, as the previous case, there is additionality, but this additionality effect is lower than the complementary group. The other test that we have done is the check on cooperation, and in particular, cooperation with rivals. In this case, the variable is not taken at firm level, but at the industry level. So we have identified those industries in which companies declare that for them, cooperating with rivals is very important for their innovation activity. And we have defined as high cooperation industries, those ones belonging to the fourth quartile. For these firms operating in these industries, we see that there is no additionality at all of R&D investments, of the direct funding. There is additionality of the R&D tax credit, but it seems that this additionality is lower when compared with the complementary group. And also there is no R&D cyclicality. So it seems that companies with high cooperation with rivals, that have high cooperation with rivals, are not sensitive to the business cycle and even not sensitive to the financing with a direct funding, basically. And this finding is also, at least for the cyclicality coefficient, in line with the prediction of the literature, because in the literature it has been argued that cooperation with rivals may go against the cyclicality hypothesis. Of course, it was not predicted the effect on the policy tools. In this case, we find that there is no additionality. When we compare industries with high patenting activities versus industries with lower patenting activities, we find a positive and significant coefficient in both cases associated with the GDP growth. However, when it comes to the direct R&D funding, also in this case, we find weak evidence of additionality effect. There is no additionality in upturns, and there is a weak additionality in downturns. Instead, for the complementary industries, we have the similar, let's say, pattern that we have found for the full sample. So with additionality associated to both policy tools, higher in downturns. A further test that we have run is a check on the competition in the market. How did we calculate this competition? Basically, we have retrieved the regulation index from the OECD website. from the OECD data for the case of Norway, of course. And we have identified firms with high level and low level of competition regulation. When the regulation is low, we have defined those industries as industries with a high level of competition. In both cases of high and low competition industries, we find pro-cyclicality, so there is evidence supporting this hypothesis. However, the pro-cyclicality is stronger for highly competitive industries. And this result is also in line with the prediction of the theory that I mentioned earlier. When instead we turn our attention to the public R&D financing and to the two policy tools, it seems that results in both cases, if we look at the significance, if we look at the sign, if we look at the magnitude of the coefficients, are more or less in line with the results of the main findings on the full sample. A further check concerns basically the hypothesis of the persistence of innovation. In order to check this hypothesis, we have defined industries with a high level of innovating firms, highly innovating firms, compared with industries having lower level of innovating firms. And innovations using data from the CIS have been, of course, defined according to the product innovations launched on the market, process innovations, or both. And these subsamples are basically the upper left, lower left, upper right, lower right quadrant, and the lower left quadrant. In these three quadrants, we see that there is no effect concerning the cyclicality hypothesis. So high innovating firms, firms operating in high innovating industries, more specifically, seem not to be sensitive to the business cycle. And this is also a finding which is in line with the prediction of the theory on the persistence of innovation, because as you recall, that theory basically states that when you are a top innovator, what you care about is to invest in research and development, and to be continuously innovating and to launch on the market innovations that because you want to be at the frontier of knowledge. So the business cycle should not really affect your ability to do that. And interestingly, when we look at the direct R&D funding, we find almost no additionality effect. Here and there is a star or a couple of stars associated with the coefficient, but overall we could say that there is indeed no strong evidence of additionality. When we look at the R&D tax credit, we find evidence for additionality. However, the magnitude of the coefficients in these three cases, in these three quadrants, seems to be lower than the coefficients associated with the same variable in the complementary group of companies belonging to industries that innovate less. Last hypothesis that is linked with the theory that I presented before is the hypothesis on ambidexterity. And also in this table, the basically structure is similar to the previous table. We have these three strategies displayed in the three quadrants, upper right, lower right, and lower left. And companies instead belonging to industries that do less of these strategies are in the first quadrant on the upper left. In this case, we find a confirmation of the cyclicality hypothesis. And this result is not in line with the prediction of the theory, because the theory had predicted a counter-cyclical behavior, or at least we should have found a cyclic behavior, right? Instead, we find the opposite. And what is interesting to notice is also that when we look at the exploitation strategy, the coefficient of the GDP growth is much higher, almost the double of the coefficient of neither approach case. So it seems that when your strategy, your innovation strategy is really focused on exploiting what you have done, it is really important to do that in periods of high demand. And this it's something that makes also sense, in my opinion, because you want to sell more of the innovations that you have produced when it is possible to do so. So when there is a period of economic prosperity, basically. We find weak effect, probably, especially in downturns, in the case of exploration and ambidexterity, when we look at the direct funding compared with the complementary group. And basically the same happens with the R&D tax credit. There is additionality, both in upturns and downturns, but the magnitude of the coefficient is lower than the case of the neither approach case. After all this analysis, we have decided to proceed and to do some robustness checks, of course. As I anticipated, we have estimated the model inverse differences to see if there is consistency of these results. We divided the sample in basically deep economic crisis of 2009 and crisis, post-crisis period. So we tried to basically dig deeper in what happened around that period, around those years. And we also performed a matching analysis based on the nearest neighbor matching approach in order to reduce the bias associated with the self-selection into the public funding. This is the table showing results taken in which the model is taken in first differences. And we find basically confirmation of our additionality effects that we found in the previous tests that we did. And this confirmation is basically concerns both upturns and downturns for both policy tools. When we look at something that is probably more interesting, at least for me, what happened around the deep financial crisis, we see that if we look at the GDP growth, the cyclicality coefficient, in the pre-crisis period, there is additionality. In the post-crisis period, which anyway includes 2009, there is additionality, but the coefficient is almost the double of the previous one. So it seems that companies after the crisis became, in their R&D investments, much more sensitive to the business cycle, much more pro-cyclical in their decisions to invest. When instead we look at the direct funding, we see that there is additionality in the pre-crisis period. This additionality is stronger in downturns, as found in the previous main analysis. In the post-crisis period, we have additionality only in upturns. And anyway, the coefficient associated with the direct funding in upturns between 2009 and 2014 is almost the half, also in this case, when compared with the corresponding coefficient in the pre-crisis period. And also the coefficients associated with the tax credit before and after the crisis seem a bit lower, especially in the downturn sample. So what happened more specifically around 2009? we have run other regressions in 2006, 2007. We took 2 years because we anyway wanted to use the fixed effect model, right? So we have a pre-crisis, during crisis, and post-crisis period. It is interesting to notice that we find basically a confirmation of what was the intuition that we got from the previous table, because we have additionality of the, for example, R&D direct funding in the pre-crisis period. We have no additionality during the crisis. We have additionality in the post-crisis period for both policy tools, but this additionality is lower. So this finding, the finding of this table, is in line, more or less, with the finding of the German paper that I cited before. That paper is a story around those years, basically. And they find that in 2009, there is crowding out. We don't find evidence of crowding out in Norway. However, there is also no additionality. What is similar to that paper is that they find additionality in the post-crisis period that is lower compared with the pre-crisis period. And this is something that we also can see in our data, in our results. So probably there is something structural that has happened to firms in that crisis that had consequences for the following years, because we see these effects not only right after the crisis, as I show in this table between 2010 and 2011, but also until 2014, as I've shown you. And we have data only until 2014 for this paper. So we can say what happened, of course, after.
Sorry to interrupt, you've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm done. So very last check that we did, as I said, the matching approach. And in this case, we have run the model taking the levels of private R&D and the first differences, the model in first differences, and we find a confirmation of the additionality effect that we found in the previous analysis, basically, with also this difference between upturns and downturns that is more pronounced, basically, the additionality in downturns. It seems to be more pronounced, the effect. So just to conclude, to make a recap of all the results that I have provided you and discussed with you this morning, we do find evidence of pro-cyclicality of R&D, private R&D investments. There is heterogeneity, however, and in fact, typically this effect is stronger for firms that receive less subsidies from the public authorities, that have more liquidity constraints, and that operate in industries with lower cooperation with competitors and lower product and process innovations. Regarding instead the additionality analysis, we find support for the hypothesis of additionality, both for the direct R&D funding and the R&D tax credit. However, this additionality effect appears to be slightly stronger in downturns. And instead, weaker additionality is found for firms that are smaller in size more subsidized, and that operate in industries with higher cooperation with competitors, lower propensity to patent, and more product and process innovations. So I thank you very much for your attention and for having given me the possibility to present this work. As I said, it's a working process, so I really welcome suggestions, comments, critiques that will be indeed helpful to improve the paper. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much to you, Marianna. It was very interesting, and you gave us a lot of interesting results to think about, and it was definitely a nice way to start the morning. So we are definitely warmed up now for the rest of the day. I would like to gather some questions from the audience, and if you agree, we can start with the early careers first. If there's any question from PhD students, I would appreciate if they can come ahead and we can start with them to give them an opportunity to interact with the speaker. I've got a question from Alessandra. I guess, yeah, I guess she doesn't qualify as a PhD student, but if there's no PhD student, Alessandra, you can go ahead.
I'm saving them, actually. I like the idea that the younger people went first. So ask again if somebody wants to ask a question that is younger than me.
Okay. Well, younger or more junior at least. If there's a junior or early career colleague who wants
They're
to
all
go
very
first.
shy. They're all very
because
shy.
the point is that it's my fault because I don't know their name yet. Otherwise, I would call them out. No worries, but they don't know their names yet.
Let them give some time to think about questions. So
right.
I'm saving them for the moment, but they have to
go ahead, yeah.
be proactive in questions. Okay, so thank you very much. Very clear presentation. I really enjoyed it, Marianna. It was really great. And it gave me so much food for thought. I'm not an expert on innovation, that's not what I do, but I could see linkages between what you do and some of the results, for instance, on migration or other things that I was doing. Okay, so random thoughts. Starting from what you say about the pro-cyclical, the theory being different than the empirical results, it came back to me what happens with migration. Migration is the same. So if you look at interregional migration, the theory predicts that when you have a recession and the gap between the poorer and the richer regions become wider, people should move more. What happens is the opposite. And some of the explanations are the same that you have highlighted for your problems. Financial constraints, for instance. People cannot move because they are poor, so they cannot relocate and so on. But one of the things that you did mention implicitly in some of your explanations, but it was not so explicit, which is really explicit in migration, is actually a psychological reason, which is risk aversion. In a time of recession, people, and I assume firms as well, become a lot more averse to risk. They change attitude towards risk. You can see it even now because normally consumption go down, investment go down, and savings go up when we have like a big recession, like now we have the COVID, right? And so I was just wondering if a big part of all this story, it's about uncertainty and how people change their aversion to risk when there is such a big uncertainty. That's the first thing. The second thing, again, you said, and that's very interesting because I didn't know that there was this idea in the literature on innovation. You say that companies, there is a hypothesis about the hoarding of highly skilled workers in downturns. It's interesting. However, I think that if some companies are doing it, I don't think they are the majority, because I was thinking of some other research linked to universities, another thing that human capital in universities. One thing that we observe is the parking effect of a recession. So when you are in a recession, you have a lot more students that park themselves at university, park in a good way, meaning that there are more applications, say, for doctoral program or something like that, because people invest in their human capital because they can't find a job. So even though I believe that there might be this hoarding hypothesis, I'm wondering how, I think it's a minority of companies. I don't see this as being on average a very generalized phenomenon. Okay, so I'm a regional economist, so you know what I'm gonna ask you. Your analysis is fantastic. You observed different dynamics in different subgroups. However, I know you have regional fixed effect, but what strikes me as being a regional economist is that you kind of assume that these companies are working in a vacuum, because you just say nothing about the location where they are. And so if I assume you didn't analyze that, obviously, because you come from a different background, but I was just wondering if you know anything at all about these innovative companies. For instance, are they all located, I assume, in the south of Norway, where there are the largest city, Oslo, Bergen, Stavanger? Do you find any in Trondheim, which is a little bit north, but not so much north? Do you find any difference, for instance, between Oslo, which is obviously bigger, and Bergen maybe, and say the medium ones that are Stavanger and Trondheim, or whatever, Drammen, whatever it is, the medium ones? So I was just wondering if they're all concentrated, if there is a difference between. I'm not asking you about the rural Norway, because I assume that no companies does innovation in Tromsø. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're all there. I don't know. I know nothing about innovation in Norway. So rural and urban in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, they're all kind of, you know, fuzzy, because it's a north-south big divide. But at least a difference between, say, the largest cities and maybe the medium one that are located in the south, if you know anything about that. And the last is the $1 million question. You talk about the crisis of 2009, but do you think, and this is really $1 million question, and you can tell me, well, I have no idea, because I have no idea either. Do you think that your results are generalizable to a crisis like the COVID one, which has so many different features than the 2009 one? It's a completely different phenomenon. Okay, so I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. I guess, Marianna, you want to answer the questions, because there were a few, and if we collect more, then you can get lost.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Concerning the first comment, first of all, thank you, Alessandra, for all these questions that give me also the possibility to think more deeply about the paper, what we are doing, what we could add, potential spin-off already. So that's great. So concerning the psychological reason regarding the risk aversion to when it comes to R&D investments, I think that this is a very pertinent question. And of course, I would love to have a variable in the survey, you know, indicating this specific aspect, you know, helping to capture this aspect. The only way that we have, I think, to proxy uncertainty is to look at financial constraints, which is anyway something that has been already done in the literature. We are happy that we find results which are in line with the theoretical predictions. So we see something that makes sense in the data. But of course, this really psychological dimension is, in our case, very difficult to measure, although I don't deny that part of the story can also go in that direction. And I would love to, for future research, to have the possibility to collect data on this, for example, and to merge this data with what we have. Concerning the hoarding hypothesis, I listed it in the theories that I mentioned for, you know, the sake of clarity and to be comprehensive. But as you could notice, we didn't have the possibility to do the empirical test because we don't have the data on R&D workers specifically, and so we didn't test the hoarding hypothesis. And for sure there is this parking effect that you talk about, and it's very likely that companies that in recessions have the resources do this hoarding, use these hoarding strategies. I wouldn't expect, for example, that highly financially constrained firms try to attract talents and skilled workers, probably because also skilled workers wouldn't self-select probably in those companies facing these financial constraints. So concerning the regional dimension, to me, it's a dimension that is very, very relevant. And we didn't have the time, unfortunately, to do this check for this presentation, although we were working a lot, to prepare, to have a nice presentation. But what you're saying is totally in line with our idea. For example, in other papers that we have done and already published using the Danish data on a different topic, we have done these checks that you have mentioned, because I think it's very important, especially for these countries, Nordic countries, where the most of economic activities is very likely to happen around the capital or around big cities. So there should be probably a difference, and it should be at least a robustness check that among the others that we have included in the paper, we do in order to see if the results, for example, are driven by certain more dynamic regions compared with less dynamic regions, and also to see, as you said, the location of these innovating firms. It is true that we use a fixed effect model, right? And we have regional controls, so we are able to capture those firms that change region. But
can I ask you something on this, because I was curious? Do you know which regional fixed effects are significant? Because that's also, it's very interesting. If you plot the regional fixed effects that are positive and significant, negative and significant, if you have any, or that are not significant, already you know for which regions the model works well, so the regional fixed effect doesn't have any significance, or regions that are outperforming or underperforming what your model predicts.
If I recall correctly, this significance that you are mentioning is present in the Oslo region.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said.
As you suggested, but thank you for mentioning this, because I think that the next step will be really to dig deeper into that and to add that part to the analysis. And concerning instead the very interesting and also challenging big question about how generalizable these results are, in particular the results of the 2009 crisis compared with the current crisis, I think that you are totally right in saying that this is probably even more pervasive, the crisis, there is a lot of uncertainty. It's an health crisis combined with an economic crisis. There is the digital transformation that is happening at the same time. Actually, it was in place already, right? But as any type of technological enhancement and adoption, it was going slowly, but this COVID crisis has basically accelerated the use of these technologies, and it's also a challenge for regions, if we come to regional economics, to understand what is the potential of using these technologies, and if, by decreasing the regional divide, for example, we could see a allocation of companies, or if not of companies, of workers that can more likely work from home, at least for some days a week, and therefore repopulate certain regions, compared with now that talents are more concentrated in certain urban areas. So I think that I cannot answer. To be honest, it's a question that is so complex, because the phenomenon is so complex that I think that we should really take into account several dimensions that would require me to really think about it. But I think that yes, for the paper, we should think about it if we want.
Just one thing about that. Sorry, Alberto, I'm really closing here, but I'm thinking that this is not sector neutral, this crisis, in the sense that R&D is big in pharmaceutical. And so that, to me, will become a big outlier in all the regressions in the future, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that also when you talked about not being sector neutral, I also think about the reallocation of labor from certain sectors, industries that now are really facing the risk. For example, the food industry, the restaurants, people working in that area that could find jobs in other industries, I don't know, healthcare sector that demand more workers, and this is a challenge for our societies, I would say, not even only economies.
Okay, nice first round of discussions. Remembering that I have a preference for questions from PhD students, and I always get questions from full professors, which is, I should say then, let's give the chance to full professors to speak so that we can have questions from PhD students. I see Sandro is there with some questions. I have other questions. No PhD students or early career. Trying my best without knowing the name is difficult. Okay, Sandro, pretend that you are a PhD student.
I used to be a PhD student, so I don't know whether it doesn't matter. Marianna, thank you very much for your nice presentation. To start with, I have a silly question. Would you please go back at the very beginning of your presentation for one simple reason? Alberto used to take care of the advert of the webinar on the social networks, and while he's sharing, he couldn't. So I just want to take a pic to share the webinar on the social networks. So just, you know, a pic. Then coming to serious things. Yeah, very interesting paper. I started with not really a question, but a curiosity. For the research question that you decided to explore. I got the motivation and then the reason for crossing the analysis of the pro-cyclicality in R&D expenditures, investments, and the pro-cyclicality of the input additionality of R&D policies. This is an industry combination. However, thinking about the typical, say, temporal trend that R&D investments show over time, say, I would have possibly liked to know more about the pro-cyclicality of other forms of additionality of R&D policy rather than input additionality. I would have liked more see whether there's a pro-cyclicality or counter-cyclicality of the output additionality of these R&D policy. And my question is, of course, whether you thought about that and whether you think that what you got in terms of input additionality get reflected in terms of the output additionality, not to mention the behavioral additionality, because this is definitely maybe too complicated to address. This connects to the second question that I have. The subject of your talk repeatedly crosses with the story of persistence of R&D and persistence of innovation. I've recently, I don't like making an advert on my papers, but I will not make an exception now, because I recently made a paper on the persistence of innovation in times of crisis, together with Davide Antonioli on small business economics, where what we found is that not looking at R&D, but looking at innovation persistence in times of crisis in Italy, there's hardly any persistence in product innovation, and the only persistence that you have is in process innovation. Now, this is the first result that we got. The second result that we got is that this persistence varies a lot with the kind of public support that the firms got. And if the firms receive some kind of public support, for example, to ICT, they actually were persistent in time of crisis. On the contrary, whether if they receive instead a public support to employment, for example, quite interestingly, they didn't get any persistence. So you have a control in your analysis for the extent of innovativeness of the firms. You nicely distinguish whether they were high product or process innovation. I'm wondering whether you might have a chance to control also for the presence of other forms of subsidies that these firms could have received. I don't know, to ICT, for example, just to mention one that I've explored. Another question is, a couple of questions which are small methodological. The first one is about the relationship between the two treatments that you have, so direct funding and tax credit. Is there any kind of relationship between these two kind of treatments? I do expect that firms that are treated in some way might be also treated in another. So yeah, just a curiosity to see whether there's a relation between the two treatments and whether this could affect your results. And also, I'm wondering whether, at least with respect to some variables, instead of splitting the sample between firms with different features, you could have played with some interaction terms in order to have more general results. And I think I can stop here, Alberto.
Okay, so thank you, Sandro, for these questions. Regarding the first one, you mentioned the possibility to look at other types of additionality. And to be honest, I go back to the initial comment of Alberto, who said, you made it again, you working on R&D additionality, because that was basically the very first topic I started to work during my master. Then it became an R&D, a project on R&D during my PhD and so on. Yes, I was talking actually yesterday with one of my co-authors, and we said, okay, we are doing a lot of work, and the next step would be to look at some output measures. And it's not simply because it's easy when you work on some data and you have some results to complement the analysis by looking at slightly different questions, but using the same data. But it's also a matter of the evidence that we have in economics of innovation lately. There is a paper that I recently read, published in the American Economic Review 2020 by Van Rienen, Bloom, and co-authors about the fact that basically there is, in the last few decades, there has been an increase in the inputs of the R&D process and the innovation process. Basically, especially firms have been increasing the number of researchers, for example, that they employ, but it seems that the advantages in terms of output are decreasing, because just to give you an example, if we look at the total factor productivity across countries, including the US, this is decreasing. So it is not a trivial question to see, to ask, okay, there is input additionality. We are devoting more resources to these innovation activities of firms, but are we getting more outputs? Because we are economists and we are interested also in the effectiveness of these when it comes to policy tools, also of these policy tools. So our idea was to look, for example, at patents or patent applications that we have in our data as a potential output measure. I was also thinking about a slightly different analysis concerning the propensity to export, for example, which could be another proxy for output, or number of products that you export abroad, number of new markets that you reach. And our idea was to it's not concrete yet, but probably we would need to write also a project for an application that we would present to the Norwegian authorities to get a financing and, to do a very big study on all these aspects. It makes sense. Regarding the persistence of innovation, thank you very much for mentioning this, and I will read with interest and with great attention your paper, because I think that we can indeed go deeper into the analysis of persistence of innovation. We have no controls for other types of subsidies that are more specific, like ICT technologies or other stuff. To the best of my knowledge, at least the data that I got from Jarle, who is the master of the Norwegian data. But these are, it's the standard R&D and CIS survey, which are run in different years, in alternate years. So they typically contain the typical questions of the CIS survey.
You know, just ask that because in some ways of a CIS, sometimes there's some, you know, additional question on related things, just a curiosity. I suspected that there were not questions something like that, but I just asked because, you know, you have this occasional panel, at least in the other countries, and I'm not that familiar with the Norway one, but yeah.
But it was great that you asked, because you can imagine that data are in Norwegian, and that we don't speak Norwegian, at least Pier Paolo and I, we are both Italian and we speak other languages, but not Norwegian. So I will ask my Norwegian co-author, who has deep knowledge and
another issue, if I can add, sorry if I interrupt you, Marianna. Another issue that similarly affected the persistent firms in Italy in times of crisis is also the kind of strategy that they declared to pursue. Now, issue is that here you just have innovation strategy, and you just accounted for that in terms of ambidexterity, exploration, exploitation. But quite in our cases where we did have data about, you know, whether the firm pursue an international strategy rather than a low-cost strategy. This also seems to matter for persistent innovation. So I don't know whether you have a chance to cross your data with other data of this kind, but the kind of public support and the kind of business strategy seems to matter a lot.
Thank you, but I will study your paper and see what I can do in terms of further checks with the data that we have available. Probably we can do something more, but that's why we study, right? To enhance our knowledge, our understanding of phenomenon. Last question concerning the methodology, relationship between subsidies and R&D tax credit. The relationship is the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. There is, they are used in conjunction, in combination, since 2002, but the tax credit is the most important policy tool for Norwegian authorities. This is what I understood from the data, and also from talking with my Norwegian colleague who was also involved in the definition of some, you know, guidelines, at least for policymakers in Norway when it came to R&D policy. Regarding instead a strictly methodology.
Sorry, so firms basically could potentially apply for both kind of policy at the same moment.
Yes, but the difference is that, as in also other national settings, when you get, you apply for a subsidy, you typically apply with a project, with an innovation R&D project, and you are selected among applicants. So you would have, at the end, treated companies versus non-treated companies. Instead, with the R&D tax credit, you get the tax credit as a function of how much you spend in research and development. And this is common to many other countries. Regarding instead the strictly methodological question of, you know, instead of splitting, why didn't you use interactions? That was the first thing that we did when we started our analysis. And I have to say, and to reassure you, that results are in line with what I've displayed this morning in the slides. To be very honest, the reason why I decided to use the split, it was for the purpose of the presentation. It seemed to me more easier to understand, to interpret the coefficient, but results are basically in line. And the reason why it seemed more easier for me is because you know, when you interact, you interact with a continuous variable, not with a dummy variable. And the difficulty came from this particular, let's say, technical aspect, and that's why I decided for the split.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Can I take other questions from the floor? I've got questions as well, but priority to the audience. I'm not very good at stimulating questions. Come on. All right.
I'm going to pass you the name of the students next time.
Yeah, please do it. Okay. Okay, go ahead, and then in case somebody can jump in. Okay. I've got a series of questions, in fact. First of all, thanks a lot for the nice presentation, and bringing us back to the old memories of the additionality. I did my master thesis on the additionality, and my PhD was about additionality. So we share that experience.
That emotion.
So thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that. I would like to start with a couple of suggestions regarding papers. One has been, I think it's very close to what you do, and is a very recent one. I didn't know that it was published, but he's a former colleague of mine, and I know he had submitted it. I checked it now. No, I'm not pretending that I know all the papers in the world. I've just checked it on Scholar. It's published on Industry Innovation, so it's a little bit of advertising to the house organ here. And it's by Jorge Velezzo Spina and Isabel Buzon, and it's about the cyclicality of innovation support. So they discuss the effect of innovation policy along the different phases of the business cycle, and I think it's very interesting for you. It's very interesting, and I'll get back to that in a second if I can, because they put, I read the working paper version, but if I remember well, they put more emphasis on a side that you don't really look at so closely, which is what happens, what is basically, what is the effect of the business cycle on the decision of the policymaker? Because all your story is about the decision of the firm, which is facing a downturn or an upturn and so on, but your story is a little bit less precise, or at least you neglect a little bit how the economic cycle affects the decision of the policymaker. I'll get back to that in a second. And the second paper is a paper by Solomon, but is with Kira Fabrizio, and is published in 2014 on Restat. And I think it's relevant in your case because they look at an aspect which is kind of connected to what you do with competition or with IPR, but they look more specifically at the role of obsolescence, which is sort of moderating the impact of demand on the decision of firms to pursue R&D investment in an upturn phase. So that's on the suggestion side. I must admit, and I second what Sandro said about the splitting. And if I was a referee, I would actually ask to present the interactions. Now, I understand that for sake of presentation purposes, these are very neat, but I was a little bit, worried in a sense when I saw that you were losing significance with the samples with the lower number of observations, which could be due to the loss of efficiency in the estimation, given the lower number of observations. So I would recommend to stress this robustness when you do the interaction a little bit more. I think it's really beneficial for the credibility of the results. So I mentioned this. I have on the methods. I would love to see a diff in diff, especially for the direct funding, especially now that there are diff in diff methodologies that allow for treatments in different points in times, and I would recommend the paper by Cerulli and Ventura. I mean, it's been used by other people like Author in 2013 and 2003, but that paper on the Stata Journal is providing you with a kind of easy to use application on Stata, which is something that I like because I'm very lazy. I go back to my main comment, which is what is the role of policy? And I think this is, I got this question when I read when I read in your results that direct funding has no significant effect during the downturn, especially during those years when you do the three splits on the three periods. And I see that direct funding doesn't have an effect essentially in the big crisis part. And to me, this is a signal that there is a little bit a sort of something missing in your story, because, for instance, if I'm thinking about this, and I've not thought it properly, I must admit, but if I'm thinking about this now, I see, for instance, the policymakers selecting firms not necessarily based on best projects, but as a sort of, attenuation of the crisis. So basically sort of rainy money or helicopter money without proper selection. And yeah, I made an Italian translation, but yeah, helicopter money is English one. But so like money going without a proper selection, so without a proper scrutiny of what could have been the best projects, so without a proper picking the winner strategy. Rather, it could be that there's a sort of confusion in the policymaker, mixing aiding the poor and picking the winner, so leading to non-significant effects. And I'm wondering whether, and I must admit that I didn't have the time to think about it properly, but I'm wondering whether this kind of allocation mechanism is behind some of the discontinuities in the results that you have presented. So whether part of the results, you have explained it by looking at how firms react to economic crisis, but I was wondering whether it's also a matter of how the policymaker reacts to this. And I think it's a relevant matter, because the policymaker is not neutral. They decide based on what they have in front of them. I appreciate that you've got a huge number of controls, and you did your best in trying to address endogeneity as much as you could, but potentially a little bit of endogeneity is still there. I don't want to be nasty on this. I don't like the nasty question, what is the instrumental variables? But I would like to suggest also a paper. I don't remember the title, neither the year, but for instance, in addition to reverse causality, there is a paper by Varrenen which basically discussed the fact that there could be a measurement error due to especially in the relation between R&D and tax credit, because firms are basically exploding the R&D investments in order to get more credits. And so they basically adopt an instrumental variable in order to address this particular issue in addition to reverse causality. So that could be something to check out. I think I'm done. It's more sort of comments than questions, but I hope they were.
But I really appreciate them. Thank you. For example, concerning the two papers that you suggested initially, the paper published on Restat 2014 on obsolescence, I'm aware of that paper. I also cited it quickly in the presentation when I discussed the threat of imitation, because that paper is about obsolescence and the weak intellectual property rights. So that paper is taken into account. But the other one on industry and innovation, for example, I was not aware of it. And as far as I understood, it's very, very relevant to what we are doing, although it basically discusses a similar topic, the same topic in a very different way, but it's good, to complement our analysis and to see what others are doing. Yes, concerning the interactions, I was also discussing with my co-author, with whom I mostly worked on the empirical analysis, and that was a very frequent discussion regarding how to present the results, and especially in the last version of the paper, that is let's say the important one, because then we can get the chance to have a revise and resubmit and then a publication. So I will indeed follow your suggestion of using interactions, as well as looking for possibilities to use a difference in different approach. And I will look at this paper that you suggested. Regarding instead the endogeneity, I know that paper, and the reason why we didn't, there was a choice that we had to be made, because when we started this paper, we said we want to use the two policy tools. but we are aware that there is endogeneity, and it's a deep problem in the literature on policy tools concerning tax credit, because it's automatic that if you increase your R&D expenditure, you get more tax credit, and therefore these positive results that we find, the additionality results on the tax credit, could be driven by a little bit of endogeneity. The problem is that, for example, with the matching, we cannot address that endogeneity problem, because the matching takes into account only the selection into the subsidy by looking at some pre-treatment characteristics that we take into account, but this is not possible to do in the case of R&D tax credit. In fact, in this case, with the NNMH, the results that I provided you are only on the public subsidy, in fact. And what we have done, for example, in another paper in which we used the matching, was to use to consider samples of firms in presence and in absence of R&D tax credit. So it was not really a complementary analysis of the total public support, but it was an analysis fully based on the subsidy, and then we made some considerations of presence or absence of this further policy tool. And this is a decision that we have to take among co-authors, because of course it depends also on the preferences that other people have about the final story that we want to tell. But I know that there is this concern, and thank you for pointing this out. Last, the results may be wrongly picking the winner in the crisis period. This is something that I indirectly was referring to when I said also in this previous slide that when we look at both cyclicality and additionality of policy tools, we see that there is a sort of persistency of these lower coefficients, for example, regarding the additionality. So it could be that this targeting has been, I don't want to say wrong, because this is of course a strong statement, but could have been done in a different way. And I completely agree, because this result is persistent in both, let's say, the medium term when compared with the short term right after the crisis. And in this case, I think that what would be beneficial for us in order to dig deeper into this aspect would be to try to speak with the policymakers and try to understand what they have done in Norway when they decided to allocate the resources in that particular period. At the moment, to be honest, I don't have an answer for that, but it would be something for the future, indeed.
Cheers, thanks a lot. Okay, other questions? We've got around 15 minutes more or less.
Yeah, I don't know whether, Adriana, are there any questions from the YouTube? Maybe not, because otherwise you would have written something.
No, they are not.
They are not. Just interacting while we're waiting for someone. So the data of the Norway CIS are anonymous, or can be crossed with other data sets?
We have been able to match them with, there is a common firm identifier with the registered data.
But you had a sense because of some reasons that everybody can?
No, we have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Typical issue with this kind of data, yeah.
Okay. There seems to be no further questions. However, we asked a lot though.
Yeah, we asked.
So,
we had a high final index of questions, but they were a lot.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, I took 2 pages of comments, so I'm very satisfied of how it
we're happy. We're happy because of that. We're happy.
There is one additional thing that I would like to add. The paper that I put aside because it was too much for just one presentation on environmental R&D and business cycle. So far, we have a result that is intriguing because we find the opposite of what we find for, let's say, traditional R&D. In the sense that for environmental R&D, we are in a different setting. We are in the Netherlands. We use Dutch data, not Norwegian data. But this should not be data-driven, of course, I don't think so. We find that there is counter-cyclicality of environmental R&D investment, private ones. We basically run an analysis similar to the one that you have seen it, considering that for some variables we cannot do this exactly the same tests that I have presented. But what is motivating and intriguing for us is to understand why. Because this could be an interesting story if we are able to understand which are the mechanisms that drive that result. And our hypothesis, which is anyway a bit hard at the moment to test empirically, so I'm telling you in case you have suggestions, is that probably the adjustment costs of doing environmental R&D is much higher than the adjustment cost of, restructuring when it comes to traditional R&D, non-environmental R&D. And probably this, given these higher adjustment costs, this could imply that it is indeed more convenient for firms to do it in recessions and not in upturns. This is basically the debate that I have been facing in the last couple of months, and the puzzle that I'm.
And how is environmental R&D capture? Is a survey question asking whether there have been green R&D projects? Yes.
And then we have data for the total R&D, environmental R&D, and for the process integrated environmental R&D, end of pipe environmental R&D. So we have these splits. And it's interesting to see that we find consistency also when we split basically the main variable, the total variable, and we do find this effect that, to the best of our knowledge, nobody has found yet. And for example, I'm curious to know if in the case of Norwegian data, we could find this variable, because in the case of the Dutch data, we use a specific environmental survey. It's not an R&D survey, it's an environmental survey that we match with the production survey. And then we run our analysis in a similar fashion, basically, as the one that I showed you.
Marianna, are you looking only at the last recession, right? 2009?
I'm looking at the time span, like a long time span, like in this case. And of course, I have the possibility to zoom in those years. Yeah.
But when you talk about downturns, you only have one in that period, correct?
No, we have one deep crisis, which is the 2009 crisis, but then we have, a definition which is similar to the one that I have used, we have used for this paper. So when there is a decrease in the GDP, we assign 0 and we say this is a downturn compared with when it increases.
And you find that happens in all these periods. That's interesting. Because the last one, for me, it's expectations. It's really time and context dependent. So in the last crisis, there was a lot of talk about environment, green, and so on. So for me, it's expectation that that's the future. But if that happens also in other periods, then obviously there is also another explanation that it's not just the time, the specific time, and maybe also place, because I don't know, but the Netherlands seems quite good with environmental stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this recall me.
Maybe there's. Shall we give the chance to Hugo to say?
Sure.
I think Hugo.
Yes.
Are you trying to? Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Saldo.
No. Okay.
Thanks, Marianna, for your very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and sorry for being late in the question. I was just taking my coffee from. Anyway. I want to ask, when you speak of public funding, do you find any difference between, in terms of effects on research and development activities in private firms? Do you find any difference between public understood as national government and public understood as local, regional government? If the public funding comes from the local level, the regional level, or the, because in terms of coming from regional government, it can create a mechanism of kind of regional innovation system. Perhaps regional governments are more sensitive to the needs of private firms, or probably not. I don't know.
We don't know. We don't have this information, but we didn't check, to be honest. But I know that because I'm quite familiar with CIS surveys, and I know that there is the possibility to look at the source of the financing. So what you're suggesting could be done potentially with our data if there is the possibility to identify what is the precise source of the financing, the central state or the regional level, for example. So this is something that I can definitely check. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hugo. Sandro, sorry,
No, I was just remembering the question that Alessandra rightly posed before about the sort of generalizability of results to this recession we are facing, the COVID one. And actually, there are some recent works on that, particularly respect to Italy, because there's this Met survey. I don't know, Marianna, whether you know it, which is the kind of survey that I have also used together with Davide Antonioli for the article on small business economics I mentioned before. Basically, this is a periodical survey on the population of Italian firms. The interesting thing is that they have added, they created an addendum they have submitted to firms after the COVID. And basically in doing that, they are working, no, people are working. I can't be more precise on that because I'm referring to one of these papers. People start working on the persistence of R&D and innovation even across the COVID recession. And what Alessandra said before in terms of expectation is crucial, because what is happening is that the expectations of people because of COVID are basically not pessimistic, even more than pessimistic, and this is affecting the results that you get in terms of persistence. Early to say yet, but there's some recent research on that. I don't know whether you have similar surveys in other countries, but in Italy you do have this additional survey in COVID time to Italian firms. I have to admit that I don't know how publicly accessible it is, but I've seen some papers working on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I will give a look and check if in Norway we have something similar. Thank you very much.
If I may add a note on that, and the fact is that R&D on environmental aspects is a different animal. Sometimes firms don't do it because of an economic advantage, but because they are forced to do it to respond, for instance, to regulation. So in that case, the argument about the opportunity cost could be prevailing over the argument on the attempt to catch an increasing demand before your competitors, because maybe the R&D, environmental R&D is not necessarily aimed at introducing new products. Nor it's observable to consumers. So it's not something that you can sort of, it's not necessarily something that you do to meet a specific demand, because the consumer cannot see the environmental characteristics of a product or the environmental performance. Not all of those, not all of them at least. So it's a rather different animal. And I guess that the response of the market and the relevance of the policy could be additional elements to keep in the equation.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I think we can thank Marianna once again for the very interesting talk and the lively debate. So thanks for having spent the morning with us. It was a pleasure. And thanks for the people who attended the seminar for the questions and the attendance as well. Okay.
It was a pleasure for me, indeed, to present my work, to be invited to speak with you, although, you know, in online, but I feel very, very happy, and especially because I got great comments. So there is a lot of work to do to improve our paper. Thank you very much.
Can you just,
Cheers.
Alberto, just remember to the attendees that...
sorry, yeah, sorry. It's my fault. I'm new. I'm the new guy. So basically, for those who are following from outside the GSSI, the seminar series will continue, and Marianna as well. You are invited to join us for the next seminar, which is a very interesting one by Michael Storper. So it's a super big name. So yeah, join us. And you can see all the details for the coming seminars on our websites. Do they do well?
Yeah, I follow you on YouTube and I check the presentation.
Okay, cool.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Ciao, ciao a tutti.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye everybody.
Marianna, grazie.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Grazie, ciao.